Inside the walls, children played, merchants traded, families broke bread together. Outside, bodies rotted alive. No roof, no guaranteed food, no one who dared touch them. In the times of Jesus, lepers did not live. They merely waited for death to arrive. It all began with a spot, a single spot on the skin. It could be a rash, a subtle swelling, a shiny mark that appeared without warning on an arm, a leg, the face. Most of the time, the person didn't even feel pain. It didn't bleed, it didn't burn, it seemed harmless. But that mark carried within it the power to destroy an entire life in a matter of days. Because in biblical times, the problem of leprosy was not just the disease itself, it was what happened after the diagnosis. And the diagnosis was not in the hands of a doctor, it was in the hands of a priest. Leviticus chapter 13 describes the process with a precision that chills the blood. When someone noticed a suspicious mark on their skin, they were brought before the priest Aaron or one of his sons, not a healer, not an herbalist, the priest. Because leprosy in ancient Israel was not treated as a public health problem. It was treated as a spiritual problem. The priest examined the spot carefully. He observed the depth. He checked whether the hairs in that area had changed color. If the hair in the affected area had turned white and the mark appeared deeper than the surface of the skin, the verdict was immediate. A single word that destroyed entire families, that separated husbands from wives, mothers from children, men from their own name and their own identity. Unclean. But the verdict was not always instant. If the priest had doubt, if the mark was ambiguous, the person was isolated for 7 days. 7 days locked away, far from home, far from their children, waiting, not knowing whether they would return to normal life or never again cross the city gates as a free person. On the 7th day, the priest returned to examine. If the spot had not spread, 7 more days of isolation. 14 days in total living suspended between hope and absolute terror. And if at the end of that period the mark had advanced, the sentence came without appeal, without recourse, without a second chance. Now grasp what it meant to hear that word in that society. There was no court of appeal. There was no second medical opinion. The priest was the final and uncontestable authority. He spoke, and life as the person knew it ended at that exact moment. Leviticus 13, verses 45 and 46, details what came next with a coldness that exposes the brutality of the system. Every instruction was designed to transform a human being into a walking ghost. The leper's clothes had to be torn, not exchanged for sick clothes, not replaced by isolation uniforms. Torn. The hair had to be left disheveled, loose, unkempt, uncut. The lower part of the face had to be covered, like someone carrying a permanent mask of shame. And the worst part of all, whenever someone approached, the leper was forced to shout with their own voice the sentence that condemned them. Unclean, unclean. Think about the psychological brutality of that. It wasn't enough to be sick. It wasn't enough to lose the home, the family, the job, the friends, the place in the synagogue, the position in the community. The person was forced to publicly announce their own misfortune, repeatedly, every day, like a ritual of emotional self-destruction that never ended. Every time a traveler passed on the road, every time a child ran in the wrong direction, every time someone unknowingly came too close, the leper had to open their mouth and shout the word that defined them before all of society. It was not merely social exclusion, it was institutionalized humiliation, repeated daily, from sunrise to sunset until the last day of life. And where did that person go after the city gates closed behind them? Leviticus 13 says the leper had to live in isolation outside the camp. In the times of Moses, that meant outside the camp of Israel in the Sinai desert. In the times of Jesus, it meant outside the walls of any city or village in Galilee, Judea, or Samaria. Put into perspective what that represented in the first century. Cities were walled for security reasons. Inside was protection against bandits, against wild animals, against the cutting cold of nights in the Judean desert, where the temperature could drop below 5 degrees Celsius in winter. Outside was emptiness, and the lepers. There was no hospital. There was no leprosarium organized by the Roman government. There was no shelter financed by the Temple of Jerusalem. Lepers were simply pushed outside and forgotten. The Roman Empire that built aqueducts, roads, public baths, and sewage systems in its provinces did not allocate any resources for the care of lepers in Judea. And the Temple of Jerusalem, which collected fortunes in tithes and offerings, did not maintain any support structure for these people whom its own religious law had expelled. Historical records and Jewish texts from the period indicate that these sick people tended to cluster together, forming small communities of miserable survival on the outskirts of cities. 2 Kings, chapter 7, verses 3-5, mentions 4 lepers who lived together at the entrance to the gate of Samaria during a Syrian siege. Luke, chapter 17, verse 12, describes 10 lepers who went together to meet Jesus on the border between Galilee and Samaria. They gathered out of absolute necessity. No one else wanted to be near them. The disease that society treated as divine curse ironically created the only form of community that remained for these people. Lepers caring for lepers, the mutilated helping the mutilated, the condemned consoling the condemned. What did they eat in these improvised communities outside the walls? The food did not come from their own harvest because lepers could not own cultivable land. It did not come from work because no one hired them and no guild accepted them. It did not come from trade because no one touched them or any object they had handled. The food came from 2 sources: sporadic charity and garbage. Families who still felt some compassion for an expelled relative could leave food at an agreed-upon spot, always at a safe distance, without contact, without an embrace, without even meeting their gaze up close. Others depended on what the city discarded. Market scraps, leftovers thrown outside the walls, fruit too rotten to sell, bread too hard to chew. That was what men and women who weeks before had owned homes, had full tables, and had families gathered for Shabbat were feeding on. Water was another devastating problem. Lepers could not use public wells. They could not approach communal water sources. Any water reservoir that a leper touched was considered ceremonially contaminated and had to undergo a purification ritual. So they depended on seasonal streams that dried up in summer, rain puddles that lasted only a few days, or the extremely rare kindness of someone who would fill a container and leave it where they could reach it without contact. In the semi-arid climate of Judea, where summer temperatures easily surpassed 40 degrees Celsius, chronic thirst was a constant companion, worsening every infection, accelerating every deterioration of the already weakened body. What happens to the mind of a person who lives like this for years? Because leprosy did not destroy only the body. It destroyed sanity. Months and years of total isolation, without meaningful human contact, without affection, without touch, without belonging to anything, created a type of psychological suffering for which there was not even vocabulary in that era. The person began to wonder if they truly deserved it, if God had abandoned them, if some secret sin, forgotten even by themselves, had provoked that curse. The religious narrative that associated leprosy with divine punishment did not stay outside the mind of the sick person. It entered. It corroded from within what the disease corroded from without. Many lepers probably came to believe they were, in fact, the worst sinners in the community, that they deserved every wound, every night exposed to the elements, every shout of unclean. And there were those who simply gave up, without formal record, without statistics, without any document that tells the story. Many lepers certainly stopped fighting. They stopped seeking food. They stopped drinking water. They lay down in a corner and waited for death to do what life could no longer sustain. They died alone, on the outside, with no one to hold their hands in their final moments, with no one to close their eyes, with no one to say a prayer. The body lay where it fell until other lepers or animals found it. But the slowest and most relentless horror of that existence remains to be revealed. The disease itself. What leprosy did to the human body over the course of months and years without any form of treatment. The Hebrew term tzarath, used in Leviticus, probably encompassed various dermatological conditions, including psoriasis, eczema, and severe fungal infections. But it also included what we know today as Hansen's disease, caused by the Bacillus Mycobacterium leprae, identified by the Norwegian physician Gerhard Hansen only in 1873. And this specific disease had a characteristic that made it especially cruel among all the ailments of the ancient world. It did not kill quickly. Hansen's disease attacked the peripheral nervous system in a progressive and irreversible manner. This meant that the person began to lose sensation in the extremities. First, slight tingling in the fingers, then numbness in the toes, then entire sections of the hands, feet, and face completely lost the ability to feel anything. Heat, cold, pressure, pain. Everything disappeared. And the absence of pain, which seems like a blessing to anyone who suffers, was in fact the most brutal sentence the disease imposed. Because without pain, the body loses its most fundamental alarm system. A leper could step on a thorn and not notice, could cut their foot on a sharp stone and keep walking without knowing they were bleeding, could burn their hand by getting too close to a fire and only notice when they smelled burning flesh, could be bitten by insects and rats during the night and not wake up. These wounds, accumulating day after day, without proper cleaning, without bandages, without any form of medical care, became infected rapidly. The infections spread through soft tissue, gangrene set in, and gradually, relentlessly, the body began to decompose while still alive. The fingers shortened progressively. The bones of the hands and feet were literally reabsorbed by the body itself, creating that appearance of mutilated limbs that has been associated with the disease for millennia of human history. Paleopathological studies conducted on first-century skeletons found at archaeological sites in Israel show exactly these marks. Perforations in the palate, complete reabsorption of the anterior nasal spine, destruction of the maxilla leading to the loss of upper teeth, and the metacarpals and metatarsals, the bones of the hands and feet, with a progressively tapered shape like pencil points, the result of the slow and irreversible destruction of tissue. The nose collapsed as the nasal cartilage was destroyed by the bacillus. The eyes could be severely affected when the disease reached the facial nerves, leading to the inability to completely close the eyelids, which caused drying of the cornea and eventually partial or total blindness. The skin of the face became covered with disfiguring nodules, especially on the eyebrows, cheeks, and ears, completely transforming the person's human appearance until they became unrecognizable to their own family. And all of this happened slowly. A leper could live 5, 10, 15 years or more in this condition of progressive deterioration. Each year worse than the last. Each season losing yet another piece of themselves. Without painkillers to relieve the pain of secondary infections that attacked the areas of the body still sensitive. Without antibiotics to fight the gangrene consuming the limbs. With nothing but dirty rags to cover open wounds that constantly attracted flies and insects. And there was the cold. The nights in Judea and Galilee between the months of December and February were brutal for those who slept outdoors. The temperature could drop to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius in the mountainous regions. without adequate blankets, without a wall to block the wind, without a fire that could be maintained throughout the night because firewood was scarce. Lepers slept curled up in shallow caves or behind boulders, shivering, with bodies already weakened by disease, struggling to maintain the minimum temperature for survival. Those who had lost sensation in their feet and hands did not even notice when the cold caused additional lesions on exposed skin. They woke up in the morning with cracks in their feet that turned into wounds that never healed. And during the summer, the heat was equally merciless. 40 degrees Celsius or more without adequate shade, without enough water, with open wounds that constantly attracted flies. The flies deposited eggs in the exposed lesions. The larvae developed inside the wounds. Myiasis, infestation of larvae in living tissue, was probably a constant companion of lepers who lived outdoors during the warm months. Without medication, without the possibility of proper cleaning, without anyone to help remove the larvae from wounds on the back or feet where the patient themselves could not reach. Archaeologists who studied skeletal remains from the Roman period in the region of Judea found direct evidence of the presence of Hansen's disease in the 1st century. A particularly significant discovery came from the shroud tomb in Exile, Jerusalem, dated to the 1st century of the Christian era. The researchers found DNA of Mycobacterium leprae in the remains, confirming that Hansen's disease was present in Judea exactly in the period when Jesus lived and ministered. This archaeological evidence transforms the gospel accounts from purely religious narratives into historical records of a real health crisis that affected real people on the same streets, roads, and cities through which Jesus walked. Consider the complete scene. A person sitting in a shallow cave or under a boulder outside the walls of a Galilean city, with half their face disfigured by nodules, missing 3 or 4 fingers, with festering wounds on their feet that would not heal because the person did not even know they were open, covering their mouth with a torn rag to shout their own shame every time someone passed along the road. Doing that every day, for months, for years, until the body finally gave out and death came as the only possible relief. And as if the physical destruction were not enough, there was the social and spiritual destruction that was equally devastating and in many ways more cruel. The instant the priest pronounced the word unclean, the leper lost everything at once. They lost the right to cross the threshold of their own home. They lost the right to embrace the children they had fathered. They lost the right to sleep beside the spouse with whom they had broken bread for years. They lost the right to participate in any religious ceremony at the temple or synagogue. They lost the right to trade in the market, to sit in the square, to drink water from the communal well. And in a society where personal identity was deeply intertwined with religious and communal life, this total exclusion was equivalent to being buried alive. There was a rabbinic tradition that illustrates the extreme gravity of this exclusion. Some masters of the law went so far as to list leprosy among conditions that were equivalent to death itself. The leper was compared to a dead person in various legal and ceremonial respects. They could not inherit property. They could not give testimony before judges. They could not participate in any aspect of public life. They were, for all practical purposes, a person who had already died, but whose body stubbornly continued to function as a cruel reminder of what they had been. And hovering over all of this was an additional layer of cruelty that made the suffering almost unbearable. The deeply rooted belief that leprosy was direct punishment from God. It was not seen merely as a disease. It was seen as divine punishment for sins committed. The most emblematic case in the scriptures is that of Miriam, Moses' sister, recorded in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam spoke against Moses, and leprosy covered her like snow for 7 days, as explicit punishment from God himself. Another devastating case is that of King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Uzziah entered the temple to burn incense, usurping a function exclusive to the priests. Leprosy broke out on his forehead before 80 priests, and he lived isolated in a separate house until he died, excluded from the palace he had built, from the throne he had occupied for more than 50 years. These biblical precedents created a devastating association in the collective consciousness. If God used leprosy as an instrument of punishment against those who offended him, then every leper bore upon themselves the visible mark of some grave sin. This logic turned the disease into a public moral judgment. Whoever looked at a leper outside the walls did not see merely a sick person. They saw someone condemned by God. And this justified, in the mind of every person who passed by, without stopping, without helping, without even looking, all the abandonment, all the indifference, all the silent cruelty of a system that treated human beings as disposable waste. Now place all of this in the specific perspective of the first century, in the times of Jesus of Nazareth. Galilee and Judea lived under Roman rule. The Jewish population endured the double pressure of imperial taxes that drained resources and the rigidity of the religious system that controlled every aspect of life. The synagogues were the center of the community. The Temple of Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of the entire nation, and the lepers were permanently excluded from both. They could not pray in community. They could not hear the weekly reading of the Torah. They could not participate in any of the great religious festivals that marked the Jewish calendar. What did that mean during Passover? Jerusalem received an estimated 200 to 300,000 pilgrims from across the Jewish diaspora. The city overflowed with people. Entire families traveled for weeks to arrive. The smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs filled the city's air. Songs of praise rose from the temple and echoed through the surrounding valleys. And outside the walls, on the rocky slopes, in improvised caves, lepers heard it all from a distance. They heard the songs they used to sing when they were healthy. They smelled the food they used to prepare when they had a family. They saw the lights they used to kindle when they had a home. But they could not approach Passover, the supreme celebration of liberation, the moment when every Israelite family gathered around the table to remember that God had brought them out of Egypt, and they were locked outside, excluded from their own liberation. And there was another dimension of this exclusion that is rarely mentioned: the impact on the children. When a father or mother received the diagnosis of leprosy, the children stayed behind. They stayed in the city with relatives, with neighbors, or sometimes alone. Children who the night before had slept in their father's arms woke up and the father was simply no longer there. There was no letter. There was no supervised visit. There was no explanation that made sense to a 5 or 6-year-old mind. The father vanished. The mother disappeared. And the other adults explained with shame and fear that that person was unclean, that God had marked them, that it was dangerous to go near. Imagine growing up with that. Imagine being 10 years old and seeing from afar, from the top of a wall, the unrecognizable silhouette of your father sitting on a rock on the other side, shouting unclean to the travelers who pass by. Imagine wanting to run to him and being held back by hands that tell you that touching him could kill you. Leprous women faced an additional layer of vulnerability, alone outside the walls, without the protection of the family or community structure, exposed to every kind of danger. Bandits who operated on the roads had no fear of ceremonial impurity. Wild animals did not respect religious boundaries. And the body itself, already weakened by disease, had no means of defense. Later, rabbinic texts mention that leper communities attempted to maintain some internal organizational structure. But the reality was that most lived in a state of pure anarchy, where the only law was daily survival. There was a case recorded in the scriptures themselves that showed leprosy did not respect social class, military power, or political position. Naaman, the supreme commander of the Syrian army, described in 2 Kings chapter 5, was a victorious general, respected by the king himself, feared by enemies. But he had leprosy, and all his military glory, all his victories in battle, all the gold he possessed could not buy the cure. An Israelite slave girl who served in his house mentioned that there was a prophet in Israel who could cure him. Naaman traveled with letters from the king, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. He brought a fortune that few men in the ancient world could assemble. And when he stood before the prophet Elisha, he received a simple command that infuriated him. Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman nearly left without a cure. His arrogance nearly prevented it, but his servants convinced him to obey, and when he submerged for the 7th time, his skin was restored and became like that of a child. The episode reveals something fundamental. Leprosy did not discriminate. It struck slaves and generals. It struck the poor and the powerful. And the cure, when it came, did not follow the paths the world expected. What kept these people breathing was not medical hope. There was no known treatment. What kept some alive was a remote, almost mythical possibility recorded in Leviticus chapter 14. The purification ritual for a healed leper. If, by some inexplicable wonder, the disease disappeared, the person could seek a priest to begin the reintegration process. The priest would go outside the walls to examine the former patient. If he confirmed that the leprosy had completely receded, an elaborate ritual began involving 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet cloth, and branches of hyssop. One of the birds was sacrificed over an earthen vessel with running water. The other was dipped in the blood of the first, along with the cedar, the scarlet cloth and the hyssop, and then released into the open field. The symbolism was profound. The dead bird represented the death of the impurity that had covered that life. The living bird, stained with blood but free, flying away, represented the new life that opened before the healed person. After this initial ceremony, the person washed their clothes, shaved all the hair from their entire body, and bathed in water. 7 days later, they repeated the entire process of shaving and bathing. On the 8th day, they presented themselves at the temple with specific offerings: 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb of 1 year, fine flour mixed with oil, and a vessel of oil. The priest applied blood from the sacrifice and oil to the lobe of the right ear, to the thumb of the right hand, and to the big toe of the right foot of the former leper. Each touch was a symbolic and public restoration. The ear purified to hear the word of God again in the synagogue, the hand purified to work again in the community among the living, the foot purified to walk again in the streets of the city and in the courtyard of the temple. But this ritual was almost fiction for the overwhelming majority of lepers. The spontaneous cure of Hansen's disease without treatment was extraordinarily rare. The ritual existed in the sacred scrolls as a theological possibility, as a written promise. But in the everyday practice of the 1st century, almost no one went through it. It was dead law, a letter that found no life. The overwhelming majority of lepers died as they had lived in their final years on the outside, without ritual, without restoration, without return, without anyone holding their hand in the final hour. And it is in this setting of absolute abandonment that the figure of Jesus of Nazareth enters. And what he did challenged every layer of that system with a silent brutality that no religious leader of the era dared even consider. Matthew chapter 8 verses 1 to 4 records the first documented encounter of Jesus with a leper shortly after the Sermon on the Mount. The man approached, already breaking the law that commanded him to keep his distance, and said something that reveals a pain deeper than any wound on the skin. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." He did not doubt the power of Jesus. He doubted the willingness. After months or years of being treated as a walking curse, as visible proof of the wrath of God, as a creature that everyone avoided and no one touched, that man had lost the ability to believe that anyone in the world could want to help him. The disease had corroded not only the body, it had destroyed the last drop of dignity. And the response of Jesus was the most revolutionary gesture recorded in the Gospels. He reached out his hand and touched the leper, touched him. In a world where touching a leper made a person ceremonially unclean, where simple physical contact with a sick person meant contamination and temporary exclusion from religious life, Jesus made a point of establishing physical contact before uttering any word of healing. He could have healed with a verbal command. He had done that before. He healed the centurion's servant at a distance without even entering the house. But before that specific leper, at that specific moment, Jesus deliberately chose to touch first and speak second. Because that man did not need only healing of the skin. He needed human contact. He needed to feel the pressure of another hand on his after an eternity without anyone daring to come close. I am willing. Be clean. 2 words. And the skin was restored instantly. Mark chapter 1 records that Jesus was deeply moved when he saw the leper. The original Greek text uses the word splanchnisomai, which does not describe an intellectual compassion or a distant pity. It describes a visceral reaction, a pain felt in the gut, in the stomach, like a punch to the center of the body. Jesus did not look at that man with the serenity of a religious leader distributing blessings. He felt the man's pain in his own body, and he responded with the only gesture that no priest, no rabbi, no Pharisee would have had the courage to make. This episode echoed throughout the entire region of Galilee like a silent earthquake. The news that a Galilean rabbi was touching lepers and healing them spread faster than any sermon preached in any synagogue. And it was not just the miracle that shocked people, it was the touch. Because in the prevailing religious system, impurity functioned as a one-way contagion. If someone pure touched someone impure, the pure person became contaminated. But when Jesus touched the leper, the flow was completely reversed. Instead of the impurity rising up through Jesus' arm, purity descended through his hand and restored the destroyed body. The entire system of ceremonial contamination was confronted by 5 fingers that refused to withdraw. But the most revealing episode involving lepers happened later, recorded in Luke chapter 17. Jesus was walking from Galilee to Jerusalem, crossing the border between Samaria and Galilee, when 10 lepers appeared at the same time. They stood at a distance as the law commanded and shouted in unison, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." 10 hoarse voices, 10 destroyed bodies, 10 interrupted lives crying the same word, mercy. The response of Jesus was different this time. He did not approach. He did not touch. He simply commanded, "Go show yourselves to the priests." The command was extraordinary and paradoxical. Jesus was telling men still covered in wounds to do what only healed men were supposed to do. Going to the priest was the final step of the purification process described in Leviticus 14, not the first. It was like telling patients still hospitalized to go collect their medical discharge. The healing had not yet happened, but the 10 obeyed without question. They turned around and began walking toward the priests, still sick, still with nodules on their faces, still missing fingers. And as they walked, the skin began to restore itself. The wounds closed, the nodules disappeared. Sensation returned to the numb limbs. 10 men healed at the same time, 10 lives returned at once. 10 people who could go home, embrace their children, sleep beside their wives, eat at their own table, enter the synagogue, participate in Passover. And here begins the conclusion that has crossed 2 millennia without losing a single gram of force. Of the 10 who were healed, only 1 returned. Only 1. The other 9 continued on their way, recovered their lives, crossed the city gates, went back inside the walls, and disappeared into the crowd as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The one who returned was a Samaritan, a foreigner, someone the Jews despised almost as much as they despised the lepers themselves. And this man, doubly marginalized, a leper by disease and a foreigner by origin, was the only one of the 10 who fell face down at the feet of Jesus and gave thanks aloud. The question Jesus asked at that moment is one of the most cutting in the entire New Testament. Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? That proportion has never changed. For every person who recognizes what they received, 9 move forward without looking back. The biblical text records the healing of the 10. But the question that remained, where are the other 9, has crossed 2,000 years without an answer. Perhaps because the answer has always been too close to each one of us.